Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt, Day 9, Chapter 10. In the May of 1863, news came from the east of another Union disaster, this time at Chancellorsville. It was frightening news for whatever one wished to believe. The very obvious fact was that a Union army, with the advantage of greatly superior numbers, had been terribly beaten by a Confederate army with the advantage of greatly superior general. The contrast between Robert E. Lee and Joseph Hooker was not one to bring either pride or hope to the Union cause. The papers had carried stories and pictures of Joseph Hooker all during the winter of 62 and 63. He was a tall, handsome man with wavy blonde hair and the look of a daredevil in his eyes. He was a hard drinker and a hard fighter. Fighting Joe Hooker, he was called, an arrogant man highly contemptuous of McClellan and Burnside, of the Confederate army, and of the possibility of his own defeat. Here was a dashing, fighting, confident man, the papers had said, the kind of general the North so desperately needed. And so he replaced Ambrose Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Then there was Chancellorsville, where handsome Joe Hooker folded helplessly before Lee's onslaught, and in the early summer of 63, papers had expressed admiration for his spirit and confidence, were screaming for his head. But the fall of General Hooker was of little importance compared to the fact that 17,000 Union soldiers had gone either to their deaths or to a Confederate prison camp as a result of the battle at Chancellorsville. The same old fear haunted Jethro and his sister as they silently plowed the young corn during the weeks when more stories of the disaster came with each newspaper. It was Shadrach Yale, one of the 17,000. But in late June, a letter came from Shadrach, a letter which reflected the deep gloom that hung over the Army of the Potomac, and the anger felt not only by the common soldier but by many of the generals for the kind of leadership Fighting Joe Hooker had exhibited. There was awe, too, in Shadrach's realization that once more a freak of chance had allowed him to come through alive, but there was no optimism in his hope for future battles. I have been through Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, hurt only by the agony of others. But there will be more battles, and you must tell yourself sternly, Jenny, that your love for me is no more sacred than the loves for which thousands upon thousands of women are weeping today. I think it wrong that I write to you with hope and optimism for our future. I think I must prepare you for the possibility, no, the probability, of heartbreak. When a man has looked upon such massive waste of life as I have witnessed in these 3 battles, the presumption to consider his own little personal dreams becomes a matter of supreme egotism. A letter from John was more cheerful. The Army of the Cumberland was on the march with General Rosecrans. For weeks they had been drilling, but now they were sure that action was about to begin. There was Confederate General Bragg in Tennessee, who must face Old Rosie before the snows fell. Most of the letter, though, was not about armies or campaigns, but of home, of Jethro's letter from the President, of Eb's behavior. There were long paragraphs in which John wanted to know how Nancy was faring, if she was well, how much the little boys had grown, whether or not they had remembered their pa. It was a good letter. Nancy read it to the family and over again to Ellen, whose lips moved while she listened as if she were trying to memorize each word. Eb wrote to Jethro from Mississippi. He was on a river called the Yazoo, not far from Vicksburg, digging ditches, chopping wood, and building bridges. The heat and the dirt were bad, he said, and there was an added hardness to his life brought on by his weeks of improper absence. But Eb accepted it with humility. It's hard to have some fellers hate you for what you done, but the blame is mine, and I'll take what they say to me and do my job till I fall over. Eb thought the Confederate General Pemberton up in Vicksburg was beginning to sweat, and that was fine, but the mosquitoes were awful, and lots of the boys were sick with malaria. The papers had much to say of the operation around Vicksburg. What was Grant doing down there, editors wanted to know. Was he going to continue stumbling all around the country, hesitating, bumbling, waiting week after week with an army mired down in disease-infested marshes? The men who wrote for the newspapers that Jenny and Jethro read aloud at night did not believe the Confederate Pemberton was beginning to sweat. Vicksburg, perched high on the bluffs of the Mississippi, had a natural fortification that Grant, with his inept stupidity, could not successfully storm any sooner than Joe Hooker could overtake Robert E. Lee. It was known that the president was being besieged to get rid of Grant. After all, wasn't it true that it was not Grant who had been the victor at Fort Henry, but Admiral Foote in his ironclads? And on second thought, white-haired old C.F. Smith had actually been the brain behind the victory at Donelson. Nobody could deny that Grant had waited too long and had been surprised at Pittsburg Landing, and certainly he had been driven back at Oxford, Mississippi. And in all these stories came the vague charges of drunkenness on the part of the discredited general. The stories were never verified, but they occurred often enough to arouse deep anger in the minds of people whose sons had died under Grant's command. Ellen and Matt felt that anger. For many months, neither Jethro nor Jenny ever mentioned Grant before their parents. Despite the pressures, though, the president did not remove General Grant. But Joseph Hooker was removed, another one of the president's generals acknowledged as a failure in the command of the Army of the Potomac. Now a new name came more fully into the public eye, George Gordon Meade. The men who came of a Sunday afternoon to talk of the war with Matt wondered how long this new general would last. The news, however, that overshadowed everything else during that June was the activity of Robert E. Lee. He had turned away from Richmond, and now, for the first time during the war, a Confederate army was penetrated into the north, into Shadrach's home state of Pennsylvania. There were many speculations. If Lee should take the cities of Harrisburg and Philadelphia, might he not go on to Baltimore and then to Washington? Did Lee plan to let Richmond fall, and in its stead to siege Washington? Wouldn't the exchange of capitals be worth his while? And weren't the chances for his success a good deal more than fair? This man, Lee, had become a legend, a fearful one for the North. Would it ever be possible to defeat him? The results of some battles had been a draw, but were they ever a real defeat? The new General Meade had never had the experience of planning a campaign or handling a huge army drawn up into battle. Robert E. Lee had little to fear as he maneuvered his army into Pennsylvania. Out of the gloom of these predictions came the news during the early July of Gettysburg, a spot of ground in Pennsylvania that Jethro had never heard of before. The news of the battle was confused at first, incoherent, and sometimes contradictory, but one thing was certain. Here was a clash that roared with a violence and terror such as the country had never known. It was a battle of unbelievable bravery and unbelievable ruthlessness. It was a clash of agonizing errors, checkered with moves of brilliant strategy that lasted through 3 hot July days, after which the news of victory came. A Union victory, and a great one, but still not a complete one. With broken young bodies piled high at Gettysburg and thousands of homes rocked in agony over their loss, the beaten army was allowed to withdraw and prepare for still more bloodshed, while the victorious army licked its wounds and made no effort to pursue its opportunities. All over the North, people were beginning to say, "What is it? What does it mean? Is there bad blood somewhere? Is there a conspiracy among Northern generals that prevents their following up an opportunity for crushing Lee's army?" Then, in the midst of the pandemonium over Gettysburg, another Union victory was announced. Vicksburg had fallen. General Pemberton, completely surrounded by Grant's army, had been cut off from all supplies and had been starved into surrender. Grant was a hero once again in the papers that had printed no good word of him in months. Ulysses S. Grant was the man of the hour, and some people with short memories said, "I told you so. Old unconditional surrender Grant is the name who will win this war." Abe Lincoln was right. They'd better send a barrel of liquor Grant drinks to some of his other generals. God bless old U.S. Grant. Of the fall of Vicksburg, the president said, "The father of the waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Jethro smiled as he read that. What he would give to talk to Shad about those words of Mr. Lincoln's, to remember with him that night when they had looked at the long wavy line on a roughly drawn map and had wondered how long the fighting would go on. Shadrach, however, was very far away and was a part of the price which the Battle of Gettysburg had cost. A letter came addressed to Matt from a spinster aunt of Shadrach's who lived in Washington, a woman of whom Shad had often spoken. The letter ran in part. He was brought here from Gettysburg with serious wounds, which became gangrenous before his arrival. I was fortunate in finding him, since I am a volunteer nurse at the hospital where he lies. He has had short periods of consciousness, during which time he has begged me to write to Jenny Creighton. He calls for her constantly in his delirium. I wish to tell you, sir, that I will gladly pay the girl's expenses to Washington and give her shelter in my home if you will allow her to make the trip. I must tell you that my nephew's condition is very critical. Ross Milton had driven up to the farm the day the letter came. The editor was often a visitor, spending hours talking to Matt, staying overnight now and then, and testing Jethro's progress in the book on English usage. Sometimes Jenny would join in taking the test, and Ross Milton would tease her a little. "The wife of a schoolmaster must learn to speak correctly, mustn't she, Jenny?" The family was always glad to see him. He enlivened for a short time the passing of one monotonous day after another. Later on the day the news came from Shadrach's aunt, Jethro sat with his father and the editor in the yard just outside the cabin door. The hot summer night was velvet black across the field and in the dooryard too, except for a ray of lamplight that came from the room where Ellen and Nancy sat beside Jenny and tried to comfort her. The three who sat in the dooryard did not speak. There was no sound in the night except for the deep, tired sobs within the cabin. Finally, Ross Milton leaned forward in his chair. "Matt," he said in a low voice, "if you will let her go to him, I'll take her to Washington and see that she is safe." For a while, Jethro thought that his father was never going to reply. The old man sat turning his cane between his hands and staring down in the darkness at his feet. Finally, he said, "Ain't it 10 to 1 that it's too late? As I see it, you'd better gamble, Matt. It would be better for the girl to have tried to get to him, even if it is too late. And if it's not too late, I'm a hard-bitten bachelor, Matt, but I don't underestimate the possibilities of a young love in a situation like this. I can pay my own girl's expense. I'll not have her beholden to a stranger. But what about you, Milton? You ain't in health for the likes of that journey, are you?" "I can clench my teeth against pain in a railway car as well as at home. I'll go with her if you say the word." "I wouldn't let them marry," Matt said slowly. "I thought she was too young, and so she is. Still, a man don't always know what's best. I only know I can't stand to see her suffer this way if there'd be one chance for her to see him alive." He reached out to Jethro then for aid in helping him to rise. "I'll have to talk with Ellen," he said. "Let's go inside." It was all arranged that night, and the next morning when Jethro awoke and went downstairs at dawn, he found Jenny already dressed in her best clothes. Her face wan and pale, but her weeping stopped by excitement and a thin hope. She put her arms around her brother, and Jethro returned her embrace. They didn't say anything. There was much too danger of a breakdown if they talked. An hour later, Jenny and Ross Milton were gone in the buggy he had driven up from Newton. They would go to Olney, take the train to St. Louis, and from there go on to Washington. Jethro did not go to the fields that day. Instead, he roamed about and finally, as if drawn to it, went up to the room adjoining the schoolhouse. The room Matt Creighton had allowed to be built because a man has the right to his own fireside after a hard day's work. The room had been used the winter before by a teacher who had been hired for the 3 winter months, a term which Jethro had gone to school for only a few days. The elderly teacher was a man without learning, without the wisdom that some unlearned men acquire with their years, without even the saving grace of kindness. Remembering the wonder and pleasure of learning when Shadrach taught, Jethro walked away from the classroom with fierce resentment. "I get more out of staying home and reading the newspapers, the way Shad told me to do, and working out the exercises in Mr. Milton's book," he told his father. There had been a time when Matt Creighton brooked no criticism of a teacher from his own children. They went to school when it was in session. The teacher's word was law, and their father wanted to hear no complaints concerning either discipline or the quality of instruction. But Matt had changed in his later years. He talked to the teacher for a while one afternoon. That night he gave Jethro permission to remain at home. "The man is not only without book learning, as I am, but he has a mean and pinched-in mind," Matt told Ellen. "The boy's right. He'll learn more by tenfold on his own." As Jethro looked about the room that morning of Jenny's departure, he felt a dull anger at the sight of the cluttered filth the old teacher had left. The room had once been a place of beauty for Jethro, a room of color and firelight, of books and singing and sense of deep friendship, which he was sure he would never have again if Shadrach died in the Washington hospital. He touched the rough-hewn bookshelves, the mantel above the fireplace, the wall where the guitar had hung. "Maybe I'll ask Nancy for soap and water. Maybe she'll help me clean the place," he whispered to himself. "If Shad ever comes back, I'd like for this room to be clean and nice for him." Then he shook his head at his own dreaming. He must remember the girl, that there's only one chance in 100 that this trip will have a happy ending. But we're going to concentrate on that one chance. Jethro sat down on a bench in the hot, dusty room. There was no comfort in being there, but he could think of no other place where he wished to be. They lived through many dreary days of waiting. Every day someone, Nancy and Jethro, Ed Turner, even Matt, when the others were too busy, would drive into town to see if there was a letter. For many days there wasn't, and the only slim comfort they could find was to remember that there was one chance, one in maybe 100. Then finally there came a letter from Ross Milton. "The boy is still desperately ill, but he will live. I am convinced of that, in spite of all my fears, for if ever a lad seized life and held on to it with both hands, it was young Yale who did so when he opened his eyes and saw that little girl you had sent to him." There were many letters from both Jenny and Ross Milton that summer, letters that brought hope and comfort to the family at home. The long ride on the trains was like a bad dream to me, the first letter from Jenny ran, but Mr. Milton talked to me with the greatest kindness, and he kept my spirits up. When finally we got here, I was so tired and my dress was wrinkled and full of dust, but the minute I saw Shad, it was like heaven for both of us. I thank you, Pa and Ma, and I will thank you all the days of my life that you let me come to him. I feel sure that you have saved his life in my happiness. Later, there came a request from the young couple, a request written and subscribed by a hard-bitten bachelor, Ross Milton. Matt dictated his answer to Jethro, and then signed his own trembling signature. My wife and I give consent that our daughter Jenny Elizabeth Creighton, age 16, may marry Shadrach Yale, a Union soldier, under the witness of a trusted friend, editor Ross Milton. Signed, Matthew Benjamin Creighton. The envelope carrying Jenny's next letter bore a self-conscious return address in the upper left-hand corner, a return to Mrs. Shadrach Yale of Washington, D.C. The first paragraph of the letter within that envelope was addressed to Jethro. And please take down the Bible, Jeff, and in your best hand write this beside my name, married to Shadrach Yale, August 14, 1863. Then she went on to describe her wedding day. I wore the white dress you give me in the kindness of your heart, Nancy, and it was washed and ironed fresh and pretty. Mr. Milton went out and bought the ring for Shad. It is solid gold, and it has little lines in it that make it look like gold lace. I think I will never take it off. I stood by Shad's bed, and there was sick boys all around, but they all smiled at me. So did Aunt Victoria, who doesn't smile very often, poor woman, because she works so hard and sees so much of suffering. Mr. Milton had to leave right away to take the train back home, but he kissed my hand before he left and called me Mrs. Yale, and that sounded so nice to me. The only thing that could have been better was if all of you that I love so much had been here. She told of her life as a young bride in Washington in another letter. I go to the hospital every day and do all I can to ease the pain that is all around me. At first, Aunt Victoria said it wasn't right for a young girl to be here, but I made her see that I couldn't sit at home when the others was needing help so much. I do what the nurses tell me, and they say I mind them and don't make trouble like some ladies do here. Some of the things I would see would have made me faint a year ago, but now I face them the way the nurses and doctors do. I do all I can to help others because I thank God so much that Shad is going to get well. Aunt Victoria has a nice big house with a real stove in the kitchen. She lets me make big kettles of soup there, and a man she knows comes and takes it to the hospital in a little wagon. I feed as many boys as I can from it because they sometimes have to eat stuff that we would throw away at home. Sometimes I bake fresh bread and spread it with butter, and Shad and them that is laying near him clap their hands when they see me begin to hand it out. It is hot in this city, and sometimes at night when I come back to Aunt Victoria's house I am tired and wistful for the silver poplars to sit under. I see all your faces in my mind, and I wonder how is Jeff getting along in the fields by himself. And I think how good it is that Nancy and the little boys are there to give you comfort. There is so much pain and sorrow here, and the city is bad too. There is filth in the streets and flies swarming, and even rats running sometimes right in front of me when I walk home. But this is where my husband is, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere in this world except close by his side. But sometimes I wonder if we are the only two happy people in this town. Jethro took the letters after the others had finished reading them and kept them in his room, where he could read and reread them to himself. He felt a great sense of peace within him as he read. Shad was going to live. Over and over he repeated those words, and in the morning when he woke with a feeling of happiness and wondered at the cause of it, he would remember Shad was going to live. He felt as if somehow he had been granted a gift in escaping a sorrow that would have scarred his life. The letter he finally wrote to Jenny with Ross Milton's book close at hand as an aid to spelling was a simple one. He had no fine phrases to help him convey his feelings, but Jenny found it a good letter, and she kept it all the years of her life. Dear Jenny, we are all feeling much pleasure here to know that Shad is better and is going to get well. We are glad that you and Shad are married. It is hard to get used to thinking that you are Mrs. Yale and not just Jenny. If only the war would soon be over, and you and Shad can come back here, it would be a wonderful, happy thing for all of us. The crops are good, but we could use some rain. Your pa and ma are well as usual, and your sister Nancy is too. The little boys are in good health, except that Johnny run a nail in his foot last week, but he is all right now. It is lonesome to work in the fields without you to talk to, and to make me laugh sometimes. But it is better for you to be with Shad. I wrote what you told me to in the Bible, and it looks fine. You ever see Mr. Lincoln? I would like to see him very much and thank him for the letter he wrote to me. What does Shad think about it that General Grant is the top man in the army now? You ask him for me. Yours very truly, your brother Jethro H. Creighton. Chapter 11. Nancy had heard from John in June. It was a long time before she heard from him again. Early December of 1863, he wrote a long letter. Then he had a long story to tell. He began, I guess you heard about Chickamauga. During the dreary days in which she had heard nothing from her husband, the name Chickamauga had held desolation and despair for Nancy. She had studied the newspaper map with Jethro, the map of Chattanooga down on the Tennessee River, with Lookout Mountain to the southwest, Missionary Ridge facing on the east, and beyond the ridge, the line of water labeled Chickamauga Creek. The newspaper accounts were hard for both her and Jethro to understand. They were stories of chaotic confusion, of bitter fighting and terrible disaster. In September of 1863, the Army of the Cumberland had finally encountered General Bragg, who was soon reinforced by General Longstreet. The Confederates thus outnumbered Rosecrans' army by as many as 20,000, and they had handed a terrible defeat to the army that had so cheerfully set out upon its march in June. A terrible defeat, but not quite a complete one, for the left wing of the Army of the Cumberland had held firm under the command of a general named George Thomas. There were many names in the papers those days, names of men and places that for a time were on everybody's tongue, and then quite often were almost forgotten, while other names gained prominence in the news. The name George Thomas had been a great one at Logan's Crossroads, when the big Virginian who had decided to remain loyal to the Union had given the Federals their first taste of victory in the West. But that had been before Donelson, and for Jethro the meaning of the war began with Donelson. Thus he had failed to identify the name of Thomas at first, but after September of 1863 it would never again be either ignored or forgotten by Jethro or by anyone of his time for whom the news of the war mattered. The Rock of Chickamauga, the papers called him, after the soldiers under his command had held out against twice their number, with the stubbornness that finally forced Bragg to give up, thus leaving Thomas and his men free to go back to Chattanooga. Other names prominent in that battle were, true to the temper of the times, disgraced and dragged through the mud. Those who fought battles comfortably within their homes or newspaper offices had more than enough mud to spare. Rosecrans, McCook, and Crittenden, who in the bewildering mountain terrain had completely lost control of the men they were supposed to command, were now accused of everything from downright stupidity to traitorous complicity with the enemy. After the hope and jubilation that Vicksburg and Gettysburg had inspired in July, Chickamauga was a dreadful reversal for the North to suffer. For Nancy, it was a name threatening her with hard news, until the day John's letter came. I guess you heard about Chickamauga. It was something we didn't like to think about. It's a terrible feeling to be beat, and though some of our boys held out with General Thomas, the most of us was ashamed and licked. But now I'm going to tell you another story, and I'm proud of this one. You tell Jet to save all the papers about this battle that I'm telling you about. When I come home, I'll read them and tell you if they'd be right. After that, John's letter was a long narrative of what had happened in the mountains around Chattanooga during that cold November of '63. Jethro had read accounts of it in the papers, but John's story was closer, more immediate. It was a vivid picture, and as Jethro read, he felt as if he were an actual witness to the unbelievable thing that had happened. John wrote of how near the army had been to starvation after Chickamauga, how the snipers located all along the slopes of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge made it impossible for a wagon load of food or provender to get through to either men or animals. We had things that would make you sick to think about, and the poor horses and mules was as desperate hungry as we was. Then he told of the reinforcements that arrived. Joseph Hooker, with detachments from the Army of the Potomac, William Tecumseh Sherman, with most of the Army of the Tennessee, and Grant came down in person. Grant, with his new promotion that placed him over Hooker, Sherman, Rosecrans, Thomas, and the others in the West. It didn't set good with us, these other armies coming in to help us out. The Army of the Cumberland hadn't done so bad in days gone by. We wasn't licked at Stone's River. We didn't like the way they appeared to look down on us. The Potomac boys are mighty highfalutin, some of them, and the Tennessee boys and us pure hated each other worse than we hated the Rebs. The next paragraphs explain Grant's strategy of the battle. Hooker would strike at one end of the Confederate line on Lookout Mountain. Sherman would hit the other end on Missionary Ridge. The Army of the Cumberland would attack the center. An easier job, John said, because they were only expected to worry Bragg enough to keep him from sending men from his center to reinforce his ends. It ain't that we was so much a patin' to fight when we had plenty of fighting. Still, we didn't like it of Grant to give us the easy post and have the Potomac and Tennessee boys looking at us like we was a third-rate army. If you'd read of Hooker's boys fighting the battle up on Lookout, you know that it was fine. They licked the Rebs up there, and we had to admit that they'd done what we hadn't. But you should have seen Joe Hooker strut. John went on to say things that weren't going so well with Sherman's men, and the Cumberland boys waited with excitement, mounting by the minute. Then finally the command came for them to take the front line trenches at the base of Missionary Ridge, which towered like a steep wall opposite Lookout. That was when pandemonium broke out. We wanted to pitch in like we had never wanted to before. We must have been a little crazy because we didn't stop at the first line trenches, but we started up the slope of the old ridge, and there was yelling and screeching like I've never heard. There was officers a-looking fine in their best uniforms, and then they went yelling with us. There was a short little Irish officer named Sheridan, and he took himself a drink and shook the bottle at the Rebs and went yelling up that slope like he didn't care was he an officer or not. It got to be a race to see what regiment would make it to the top first, and I want you to know that old 104th Illinois didn't do so bad. And the Rebs, I guess, thought we was ditched, and they began to give way. After that, the center of Bragg's line cracked all to pieces. I don't know what the paper said, but I want you to know that it was the Army of the Cumberland that done it. Jethro rewrote John's letter and sent his copy to Shadrach and Jenny in Washington. He made mountains of chips and stones out in the wood lot, and showed John's little boys how their father, along with the boys in the Army of the Cumberland, had scaled Missionary Ridge and had so broken the center of the Confederate line that General Bragg had to order his divided army to retreat and to leave Chattanooga in the hands of the Federals. Nancy wrote to John of Jethro's interest in his description of the battle, and weeks later John spoke of it in his reply. What you told me about Jeff's interest made good reading, and it brings comfort to me that the one brother I've got left is close to my little boys. In November of that year, the president made a speech at Gettysburg. Papers all over the country printed it, but they were not agreed upon its quality. One of the papers Jethro read claimed that the cheek of every American must tingle with shame at the silly, flat, dishwatery utterance. Another said that the president's speech would live among the annals of men. Jethro didn't know. He loved Mr. Lincoln and felt deeply drawn to him. It angered him to read the mouthings of hate directed toward the president, but as to whether the address at Gettysburg was a great one or just another speech, an 11-year-old farm boy did not know. He read it aloud to his mother. It has the ring of the Scriptures about it, Jeff, she said. He nodded. It had, somewhat, he thought. That winter many people were talking of peace. The end could not be rushed. There would be fighting to the last ditch, but the end was inevitable. A people pushed to the extremities that existed in the South could not possibly hold on, the papers claimed. But they did hold on, and as the war trailed drearily on, vindictiveness toward the stubborn stand of the seceding states grew steadily more bitter in the North. The vindictiveness was urged on by men in high places who resented the president's spirit of clemency as violently as they resented the tenacity of the South. In December, Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation of amnesty, in which he promised pardon and full rights to any individual Confederate who would swear to protect the Constitution and the Union of the States, to abide by the government's pronouncements against slavery. He promised, too, that a Confederate state could return to the Union whenever 10% of its voters should reestablish a loyal Union government within that state. Never have I loved him so much, Matt exclaimed cheerfully, and Jethro remembered the words in the president's letter. There will be much criticism, but if I err, it will be on the side of mercy. The criticism of his act came with quick violence from all sections of the country. In the South, the Confederate Congress cried out that if the Washington government called for restoration of the Union, it must merely setting a cruel trap for the deluded, that it would be only a relationship between the conqueror and the conquered, that it would mean personal and public degradation and ruin. And in the North, the chant of hate against Lincoln became stronger than ever. His proclamation of amnesty was little better than treason. The president's detractors shouted, and many people began to consider it high patriotism to talk of the coming wholesale execution of rebels. The third winter of the war went by with the echoing story of suffering and death. In the early part of the war's fourth year, General Grant was placed in command of all the armies of the United States. With this promotion, another general fell to a lower place. General Halleck, who had never quite risen to his position, was finally relegated to the list of those whose names had soared for a while, then fallen into near obscurity. Jethro could remember the early days of war when he had felt resentful upon learning that Halleck was Grant's superior officer. In March of 1864, he felt a glow of personal triumph that his resentment had perhaps been justified. In Washington, Shadrach Yale was slowly struggling back to health in the safety of his aunt's home. Now that Jenny was with him, Shad's letters were addressed to Jethro. They were like gifts to the lonely boy. He read them over again and again, and then placed them carefully in the big envelope containing the president's letter. Shadrach wrote that he and Jenny had seen the president and General Grant as they drove through the Washington streets together. The president's face is deeply lined, and his cheeks are gaunt. I have seen so many soldiers whose cheeks have had that sunken look, even though they were young faces. The president looks at least 20 years older than the pictures you and I used to study together in early days of the war, but his face was full of lights as the crowds cheered. I think he knew they were cheering Grant, and that pleased him, for I'd guess that he, too, wanted to cheer the little man who sat beside him. Grant does not have the appearance of a great general. He looks awkward, ill at ease, and carelessly dressed, but we have had enough of charm and polish. This commander, who doesn't even walk like a military man, is the one who will, I believe, restore the Union. Early in 1864, talk of the presidential election was in the air. Jethro had been barely conscious of the excitement, anger, and vicious invective that had accompanied the election of 1860. Now he was fully conscious of emotions of even deeper violence in the talk of men in the community and in the papers that he read. There was hatred for Mr. Lincoln within his own party, as well as in the Democratic Party. Thad Stevens, the aging floor leader in the House of Representatives, pushed his program of no mercy to the South and let his contempt for the president spill out in every speech he made. Midwestern papers reprinted the blasts of Wendell Phillips in the East, and the editor Horace Greeley, who asked rhetorically if this man Lincoln was the sole hope of the Republican Party. The answer, he thundered, was in the negative. Did not such men as General Fremont, General Wade Butler, General Ulysses S. Grant rank high above Abraham Lincoln? The Democratic Party's strongest asset lay in the weariness of war throughout the country. Men lost were no longer counted by the thousands, but by the 100,000s. There had been blundering, betrayal, and corruption during the entire progress of the war. There was fierce resentment among many when the President and the Secretary of War used every resource at their hands to raise more troops to support Grant and Sherman. And with all these angers, there was an added agony when hopes for an end to the war were crushed as the year progressed. The country had waited expectantly that summer to hear of a decisive victory by its hero Commander Grant. Instead, the news came of the Battle of the Wilderness, a horrible story of fighting in the blazing woods, with losses mounting by the thousands, and with Lee still holding firm. It's the sound of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville all over again. Soldiers of the Army of the Potomac, loyal still to McClellan, had nodded cynically at the advent of Grant. Sure, they said, Grant looked pretty good in the West, but remember that out West he hadn't met up with Bobby E. Lee. Now, in the Battle of the Wilderness, and later, for a full month of fighting at a place called Spotsylvania, and along the Chickahominy River, and finally at a blazing crossroads known as Cold Harbor, Grant had met Robert E. Lee, and he was no more a conqueror of that legendary general than George B. McClellan had been. There was one difference, though. Grant would not give up. He gave his opponent no quarter, and the stubborn tenacity which he held in the face of Lee's punishment was something the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac had never seen in their idolized General McClellan. But for all of Grant's determination, the North appeared to be no nearer victory than it had been before the fury and waves of death had begun the month before. He had, however, managed to get away from Lee, and moving south, had come up to the town of Petersburg. At that, Northern papers took hope and began shouting. Through Petersburg ran the railroads by which Lee's army received its supplies. If Petersburg were taken, then the cry of "On to Richmond" would be at last be fulfilled. Jubilantly, the news came. Petersburg was in Grant's hands. Then a retraction. Petersburg was not quite in Grant's hands, only the outworks. And finally, a siege would be necessary before the city would be in Grant's hands. A moan of disappointment and despair went up over the country. The end of the war had appeared to be so near, and now, after the horror of the wilderness and Cold Harbor, there must be a siege of Petersburg. The nation was ready to look for peace. If the price of peace was the dissolution of the Union, maybe people felt that compensation lay in stopping human slaughter. The Northern Democrats saw their chance. Lincoln had been nominated in June in spite of the reluctance of the men within his party who hated him. But in late summer, with the word of federal reserves pouring in, many papers shouted that he stood no chance for re-election, and to Jethro it seemed that most men were agreed. Ross Milton was not, however. He said, "Lincoln will win. When it comes to the final vote, the country will not admit that its sons have died for nothing." But Matt shook his head. "I want to believe it," he said, "but I don't. I think we're in the midst of an awful crumble." In Chicago during the month of August 1864, the Democrats nominated George B. McClellan as their candidate for the presidency. After days in which the Democratic nomination filled the papers, there came suddenly the thunderbolt of General McClellan's response to his nomination. Shadrach wrote of that response to Jethro, "I could not cheer General McClellan at Antietam. I watched the men who had been under his command for months and wondered at the love they felt for this man who, to my way of thinking, had prolonged the suffering and bloodshed of this struggle through some aspect of his nature that lacked not the courage to face personal danger, but the courage to risk being wrong. Today, as I read General McClellan's response to the Democratic Committee, so set to elect him as an advocate of their peace platform, I thought that I must write to you and point out a quality of courage in this man that I wouldn't have believed to be there. I gave a yell when I read it, and your sister was aghast. She said, 'But, Shad, I thought you were all for Mr. Lincoln.' And I had to explain to my dearly beloved and legally wed Jenny that I am all for Mr. Lincoln, but that today I've had to give a belated cheer for my former commander." Shadrach sent a clipping from a Washington newspaper in case Jethro had missed General McClellan's response. The article quoted the general as saying that as far as he was concerned, the party's platform meant that the North was not to offer peace on any terms short of the reestablishment of the Union, that to accept anything else would be an insult and an affront to the thousands of soldiers who had died in battle. Shadrach added a note at the bottom of the article, "This is the man whom the radical Republicans accused of traitorous disloyalty." Then to the sullen and despairing North there came heartening news, the first of which was in a dispatch from Mobile, Alabama. In August, Admiral Farragut had led his fleet to the torpedo-infested waters of Mobile Bay to capture the Confederate Tennessee, said to be one of the most powerful warships afloat. After that, land forces had captured 3 forts guarding the city of Mobile, which meant that the Confederacy had lost its most essential port on the Gulf of Mexico. In itself, the capture of Mobile might not have been a matter of such rejoicing had not other good news arrived upon the heels of it, but in September word came to Washington from the excitable general who, months before, had annoyed Congress with his predictions of a long and difficult war. William Tecumseh Sherman had telegraphed the president that the city of Atlanta, Georgia, had fallen to the Army of the Tennessee. "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," was Sherman's message to Mr. Lincoln, and that, coupled with the news from Mobile, sent the North into paeans of thanksgiving. News of victory also came from the Shenandoah Valley, where gallant, steel-nerved Phil Sheridan had defeated the Confederate General Early at Cedar Creek. Sheridan had made a dramatic ride to rally his straggling troops and turn a nearly lost battle into a decisive Union victory. The North was still war-weary, but it was no longer hopeless. The prize was almost within its grasp. The goal for which thousands of boys had died or suffered the agony of prison camps was almost won. It would have been folly to give up with victory so near. So men went to the polls that November and re-elected Abraham Lincoln. The preponderance of the soldier vote was for Lincoln that year. There had been unrest and anger, despair, and desertions by the thousands. Still, when the vote was taken, the men whose sufferings had been past all belief now took their stand that the war should go on. The news of that vote was heartwarming to the tired president. So, too, was the fact that all the northern states except Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey were one of accord with the soldier vote. That included Mr. Lincoln's home state of Illinois. But to Jethro's disappointment, it was not southern Illinois that gave the state's electoral votes to the president. Even Sangamon County, where Mr. Lincoln had lived all his mature years, gave a plurality of its votes to General George B. McClellan. After the excitement of the election, the papers began to speculate upon what had become of the Army of the Tennessee. It was lost in a mysterious silence somewhere in Georgia. There were rumors that the Confederate General Hood had encountered Sherman and had cut the Army of the Tennessee to pieces, but they were unconfirmed rumors. When Hood came up from Georgia and through northern Alabama into Tennessee, he did not claim to have defeated Sherman's army. The Army of the Cumberland was in Tennessee, ready to face the same General Hood, and in command of it was the Rock of Chickamauga, General George Thomas. Some of Thomas's men had been sent off to the Army of the Tennessee with Sherman. John wrote home that a lot of the boys were behaving like spoiled youngins because they believed the Georgia campaign would be a lark with little fighting, while the Army of the Cumberland must stay on to do the stern work of keeping Tennessee in federal hands. Perhaps General Hood believed that the Army of the Cumberland, weakened by loss of regiments to the Army of the Tennessee, could be overcome and Tennessee regained for the Confederacy. Perhaps he hoped that Sherman would be recalled for Georgia in case of General Thomas were too sharply threatened in Tennessee. Whatever the thinking about the move in this bloody chess game, Hood appeared in Tennessee in November of 1864, and the two armies clashed at Franklin, only a few miles south of the city of Nashville, where Hood was worsted. Then came another clash at Nashville in December, and it was from there that John's next letter came. The first page told briefly of the battle. There was days of sleet, and we couldn't make a move. We sat there waiting and wondering what was going to happen. Then the weather turned warm. As soon as the sleet was melted, we started the attack. The fighting was awful bad, but Hood's army, what there was left of it, was drove out of Tennessee and back down to Alabama. Tell Jeff not to believe that Grant is the greatest general in this war, and I tell you they don't come greater than that old Pat Thomas. A second sheet was added to this letter, evidently days after the first had been written. It carried news that those at home had almost despaired of hearing. It is late at night, but I have a story to tell, and I must write it because I can't sleep till I've told you. A few days ago, I was put in charge of helping to feed the Reb prisoners that we took in this battle. Tonight, when I walked amongst them, I seed a man. I swear to you, I thought it was Pa at first look. The man had a light-colored beard like Pa's was when I was a boy, and he had the same blue eyes with Pa's look in them. I stopped in my tracks and looked again, and then I seed it with my brother Bill, growed to look as old as Pa looked a few years back. I didn't ask to stop or take his hand, but I went close, and under my breath I told him I'd try to come back, and I think he nodded, but it was so little that I scarce could tell you he nodded at all. Then I went to my captain and asked him if I could talk to a Reb prisoner that was my own blood brother. My captain looked at me. Your brother, he said. And then after a long time he said yes, that I could go ahead. Well, I found Bill, and we sat together with thousands of sad men all around us, and things was cold and foul everywhere, but we was brothers again, and we talked like brothers ought to talk. He wanted to know all the news of home, and I told him how Tom died at Petersburg landing and of Eb deserting and then going back. I told him how Jeff had read a letter to the president and got an answer back. I told him about Pa's sickness and how my boys was growing up fine with their good little ma bringing them up alone. I told him how Shadrach was near, about killed at Gettysburg, and that now and him and Jenny was man and wife, and all the time his eyes was on the ground and he was saying nothing. But when I stopped, he'd say, tell me more, John, and I'd try to remember more of what was in your letters. Then come the time when I must go, and we shook hands for a long time like as if our fingers didn't want to let go. And when I turned to go, he called me back, and he asked me to be sure that I told this to Ma. And so I am writing what he said, with the hope that it will bring comfort to her. Ma, Bill wants that I should tell you this. He was not at Vicksburg landing. That bullet was not fired by him.